Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IIRP Graduate School free webinar, Virtual Relationship Building in Higher Education. The COVID-19 pandemic has created disconnection everywhere, and we are increasingly turning to technologies that can help foster strong relationships and a sense of community. College campuses and students are particularly impacted. During this 60-minute webinar, we will explore the general topic of relationship building through restorative practices on campus, as well as how technology helps. My name is Joshua Wachtel. I'm the communications specialist for the International Institute for Restorative Practices Graduate School. Today, I am joined by John Bailie, IIRP President and Associate Professor, Pablo Cerdera. Pablo is the Associate Director of Restorative Practices at the University of Pennsylvania, and Dan Hoffman, who is CEO and owner of the Circles platform. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to get started with a poll. Ben, can you bring that up? Ben Wachtel is working on the back end, helping to make some of these things happen. And we would just like to know what context you're working. We know it's targeted towards higher education, but I believe probably people from other contexts. So let us know where you're coming in from. If you're just joining, please use the chat function and let us know where you are calling in from. And what your association is, so that everybody can see. We're using the question and answer function today. That will be for the panelists in the second half of the program. So if you have questions as they come up for the panelists, please let us know there. This webinar will be recorded and will be available within a day or two of the webinar. All right, so it looks like 42% in higher education, 38% K through 12, a couple percent in youth justice, criminal justice, social work settings, neighborhoods, communities, families, and others. Great. All right. Thank you so much. Let's have poll number 2. For those of you working in higher education, what areas are you looking to use restorative practices, so we can give everybody a sense of that, and the panelists will have a sense. We know that folks are using these practices in all kinds of ways. The first half of the webinar, just structurally, will be short talks by each of the 3 panelists presenting on their area in higher education, or using technology to build community and to build relationships. And then in the second half hour, we'll be taking your questions and answers and opening it up to a free-flowing panel discussion. So we hope you'll type in your questions, and you can also upvote questions if somebody's typed one in that that you guys want to use. All right, so at this time, I would like, let's look at this poll. Can you stop the results, Ben? Okay, 21% of folks are using this in academic areas, housing and residential life, 8%, 3% campus activities, 1% drug and alcohol program, 6% in health promotion, 1% in disability resources and services, 28% diversity, equity, and inclusion, 5% sexual violence related programs and services, 6% human resources, and 22%, 24 people in student conduct. So nice to have a diversity of uses. And this is absolutely one of the things that we've been seeing in higher education, is there's so many applications as higher education communities encompass so many things. So at this time, again, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming. And I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Dr. John Bailie is President and Associate Professor of the International Institute for Restorative Practices, a graduate school that offers master's degrees and graduate certificates. The Institute also provides professional development, creates publications, and fosters research to help develop restorative practices, the science of relationships and community. For a decade, courses at the graduate school have been offered primarily online and feature strong relationship building between students and faculty. Welcome, John.
All right, thanks a lot, Josh. Appreciate it. Josh and I talked a little bit about this before the webinar, and of course we know Dan from Circles very well, and we're getting to know Pablo and the work at University of Penn, and we've had a lot of contact recently with colleges and universities that are looking to enhance relationships, or were already working on that, especially pre-pandemic. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to think, especially now, post-pandemic, as if the considerations around online engagement have somehow substantially changed. And I think in some ways they certainly have, in terms of the scale at which institutions now, I mean, if you look at the great diversity of colleges, universities, and community organizations represented just in this webinar, there's a wide diversity of needs for stakeholder engagement. But I think there are some things about online engagement that were actually as true before the pandemic as they are now. I think what's changed is the push to adopt new modalities a lot faster, certainly to scale them beyond what things probably were at most colleges and universities in March of 2020. But I think the most important things, which is what I'll talk about, is the need to be deliberate about what we're doing with online and virtual relationship building. So, just a few points about that before I turn it over to the other panelists. I think one is, and this is one of the things that we were already doing at the IIRP. So, we had our own disruption that we faced in the wake of the pandemic. But one of the things we didn't face was a tremendous amount of disruption regarding online engagement, because in essence, we were already doing it. But some of the decisions we made, which I think can also be scaled up at larger institutions, was number one, to not see a dichotomy or a competition between virtual engagement and relationship building or in person. The reality is they are two different modalities. They're two different things. They have their own strengths and weaknesses. So for instance, with in-person engagement, there's no real replacement for sitting down face-to-face at a table and having a cup of coffee with someone. Yes, it's nice to see them on Zoom, but it doesn't replace the human need to have those kinds of interactions. The other things that I think are difficult for virtual engagement, especially when you're scaling it up across an institution, is when you don't have everyone physically in the same space, the informal things that happen, meeting one another in the hallway, talking to students, in a much more organic way after class. Those things have to be done a lot more deliberately when you're moving to online engagement. But online and virtual engagement, and I'm not just talking in the classroom, I mean across all of the things a college or university might do, has its own strengths as well. I know, the Circles platform, and I'm sure Dan will talk about, for those of us concerned about power, voice, belonging, and equity, whether in a classroom space or a student services space, there are things that one can do online that lends itself more towards equitable participation and facilitation over, for those of us who are very confident and facile with language or used to sort of commanding space. There's online tools, particularly some of the diagnostic things that are now available in some of the platforms, that gives you a real sense, in this conversation, who did most of the talking? In the course of this project, has there really been equal voice given to all the various stakeholders that are present? Some of that's a lot easier to do online. Some of the other things that happens, I think, with virtual relationship building that is a real strength is advantaging different learning styles. Not all of us are great oral learners who can listen to a lecture for 2 hours and grasp it. Part of what we do deliberately at the IIRP, which is sort of built into our platform, is we have really clear expectations for all of our faculty that, when people come together online, that is for group interaction. If you want to give a lecture, lectures are wonderful, record it ahead of time. People can watch it multiple times. They can watch it in chunks that works and can be integrated into people's lifestyles. We're all balancing now being home. Our work came home, and our home has come to our work. So we all have children and partners and lots of other family things that we need to deal with. The making some of those static pieces that you would normally have to be sort of a captive audience for at a college or university can be done in a much more convenient way. And then when we come together online for anything synchronous, that should all be about group formation. So, I'll close with, I think one of the more deliberate pieces that, I've encouraged other college and university leaders to think about is that this should not be something, especially now, that the whole world has been pushed to online engagement. We've shattered a lot of the resistance we might have had in some of our staff or faculty. I'm not saying the resistance isn't still there, I'm sure, but the idea that that multiple hundreds of stakeholders cannot be engaging online at the same time, or that they shouldn't. We've broken through that barrier because the whole world has been forced to use online engagement. So in that now, we need to be as deliberate about how we organize, how we facilitate, and the points in which we invite people to online spaces, just as we were thinking about classrooms and in-person learning. And I think that's going to be a very new task for a lot of institutions. So the final thought would be to say, when, as a leader, as an instructor, as a faculty member, as a staff person, if you're in charge of holding, engaging online space, to number one, see it as not better or worse, but simply different than in-person engagement. Think about what the strengths are with online space that you can actually enhance and do more deliberately, number two. And then finally, I would say, when you think about a student's or a faculty member or a staff person's online experience, it's not just in the classroom. To think about the sum total experience that a stakeholder has with the entire institution, from the moment they jump on a Zoom call with a student services representative, or to talk about a degree program, or to talk about enrolling, from the off hours meetings that faculty might hold. We've held lots of informal coffee hours and BYOBs with students, to the classroom. The classroom should seem like a seamless part of an experience that is sum total designed to build relationships and is really focused on that person's experience. I think the more deliberately higher education institutions do that, I think that is what it means to really enter the digital age on purpose, which of course will include, in-person interactions again in the future. Some of us are having them now, but I think doing both, the in-person space and the online space, strategically, deliberately, and in the online space in particular, focusing on community and relationship development as a core part of what everyone does, from staff, support staff, through faculty. I think that's really the key.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. So next up, we're going to hear from Pablo Cerdera. He is Associate Director of Restorative Practices at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been a restorative justice practitioner, youth worker, and educator. Born and raised in the Philadelphia area, he is committed to the ongoing fight for racial, economic, and social justice. He assumed his role at Penn earlier this year and is working to develop a center for restorative practices to be used in a variety of ways across the campus. Welcome, Pablo. Can you tell us about some of those ways? Really looking forward to hearing that.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Josh, and thank you for having me here today. So as was just mentioned, my name is Pablo Cerdera. I use the pronouns he, him, and his, and I've been in my role here at the University of Pennsylvania for about the last 9-10 months. I started just prior to the shutdown that was related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, as you can imagine, it required some pretty quick pivoting in terms of what my plans and expectations were for how I was going to be engaging in this new community. It's important, I think, also for me to mention that this is my first time working in the higher ed space. All my previous work, as was mentioned, was in the context of community-based organizations and nonprofits. And so working primarily in primary and secondary schools and in the relationship with the criminal system. So there was a lot of pivoting that I was doing personally when I came into this role, with or without the shift to an all online environment. The way that the things that I've been tasked with to do at the University of Pennsylvania is to bring the values, principles, and practices of the restorative worldview to as many aspects of campus as I can manage. So that means I'm tasked to work with students, staff, faculty, and community members with the goal of bringing these practices, bringing this philosophy to fruition within this environment. Part of the way that I've been thinking about that, and part of the way that we structure my office and my program, is we identify sort of 3 interlocking, interconnecting, and separate pathways to restorative resources on campus. So I sit in the Office of Student Conduct, That's the part of the university where my pay comes from. It's where my reporting line goes to. And that's because one of the key areas that we were talking about and that was hoped for when my position was created was the ability to use restorative processes in the process of accountability for students or other members of the community who have caused harm, right? And so we have this accountability pathway. We use circles, conferencing, and other tools to support people in being accountable when they've caused harm on campus. I also think about the sort of healing pathway. So this is sometimes directly interrelated with the accountability process. Sometimes the healing process and accountability process are more or less one and the same. Sometimes they're entirely separate or divorced from one another. But we also do processes that are all about using the tools and techniques and philosophies of restorative practices to support individuals and members of our community when healing, either from harms that have happened within Penn communities or getting support and healing from social, structural, global harms like the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've been holding, for example, regular circles for different constituencies and affinity groups on campus to offer support through Circle in response to COVID-19, in response to this re-inflammation of anti-Black violence here in the United States. The third pathway that my office seeks to build is the community building pathway, right? The theory here, as those of you who are familiar with restorative practices as an approach, is that tight-knit communities where there are deep and authentic relationships, are first of all less likely to do harm to themselves, and secondly, and more importantly, I think, are more resilient in the face of harm, right? Harm is something that, as we all know, happens inevitably. But when you have genuine and deep relationships with others that you're in community with, you're better able to access the sort of positive social supports that you need to be resilient in the face of those harms. So all of these things, as I say, I describe these as sort of three different pathways to access or to engage with restorative practices here at Penn. And like I mentioned, they are all interconnected and overlapping. I also want to highlight that we are concerned at restorative practices at Penn with interpersonal harm as well as systemic and structural harm. So everything that was coming in that survey that we took at the very beginning of this seminar, from diversity, equity, inclusion to sexual violence and sexual misconduct to sort of more typical run-of-the-mill student conduct issues and issues within academic departments and programs. We're trying to bring these practices to bear in all of those areas. So it's a lot to do. I'm currently an office of one, though I'm very lucky to have a wide team of partners throughout the university who are knowledgeable and committed to these practices. So as I mentioned, when I started, I was planning for an all-in-person forms of engagement, and started February 1. By mid-March, I was at home, and so was everyone else. And so I had to, like I mentioned, pivot quickly to online engagement. And John, I so appreciate everything you shared about the uniqueness and the strengths of online engagement. I have to be honest, prior to this, I was somewhat skeptical about the ability to engage deeply in a restorative way over the computer, over a distance, virtually. And what I have found is exactly what John described, that virtual or online engagement is simply different than in-person engagement. Not better or worse, but different. And that when you engage honestly with what the differences are, you're able to, or I've been able to, make some really positive and effective spaces, both to heal harm and to promote positive community. So a key example, and this is where Dan, our next presenter, and I got connected. Wharton School, our business school, accepts many hundreds of new students every year. And last year, in the beginning of last academic year, they used circle practice as part of the welcoming in new student orientation. And when I arrived, there was an opportunity to have conversation to start planning how could we expand and deepen the use of circles to proactively build community among incoming students in Wharton. And then the pandemic hit. And so we had to shift gears and think about how do we do a program where we're taking 80 first-time circle keepers. We encouraged the existing student leaders to build their skills as circle keepers, but using 80 first-time circle keepers in an all-online format to create a welcoming environment, a supportive environment to plant the seeds of positive community for incoming students in Wharton. And so I was lucky enough to learn about and discover the Circles tool from a colleague at another institution, and started exploring it, first of all, for interpersonal harms, right? I was holding small circles with it for cases where sort of student on student harm. But then the idea came that we could use this, as I used it more, I realized it was an excellent tool, not only for restorative circles and conferences, but also to support the creation of a positive container, a robust container for these types of conversations. And it offers a lot of, I would say, guide rails, supports that help make it easier for even less experienced facilitators to be really successful in holding the types of positive online spaces that John was just speaking about for community building. So over the course of the summer and what was ultimately a very quick turnaround time, a team from Circles and from Wharton and myself worked really hard to build the plan, run the training, all using Circles tools to get the facilitators prepared. And then on the day of, run, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 circles that same day, all on the Circles platform, and created, I think, a really, really effective program to begin building strong relationships within the Wharton school. And the cohorts that met in Circle continued to meet throughout the semester and have continued to meet throughout the semester, giving just the seeds, the foundation of positive social relationships for our incoming students, who many of whom have not been to Philadelphia, most of whom have not been to campus. And so I really appreciate the ways in which these tools and these practices have been able to merge, and honestly outdone my skepticism about the ability to hold these types of spaces productively and positively online. So thanks everybody for having me, and I'm excited to talk with you more.
Thank you, Pablo. That's great. So now we'd like to bring in a little bit different perspective from the technology and how that informs some of these types of relationships. Dan Hoffman is an entrepreneur in the tech field who failed twice, succeeded once, and has started from the beginning again. He currently resides in Brooklyn, New York, where he started Circles Learning Labs with a mission to create profound individual and organizational growth through human connection. He's here today to speak about the Circles platform, circl.es, which has been used by Penn's Wharton School of Business, as you just heard a little bit about, and in a variety of settings to foster connections online. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Josh and John, for having me, and Pablo for the really kind words and your partnership all around. I love this question, and I think when you ask about building relationships virtually and maybe at scale, building community, where I go is, what kind of relationships? What are the underlying assumptions, the philosophy of those relationships? When you bake these things into technology, they can have real impact at scale. When you bake these philosophies and assumptions, Facebook is the famous example we're all debating, are certain philosophies around democratization of free speech and free market for information, the right ones when transformed into philosophy. As an entrepreneur, I'm pretty new to the field of education. I've spent just the last 6 or 7 years, unlike many of you on this call, on this. And when I thought about devoting this chapter of my life to making a contribution here, I went back to a really powerful experience that I'd had as a CEO coming up, learning how to do that job in a peer group. It turns out that Forum is a circles practice. It's very popular among CEOs, and it's described by a lot of people as transformative and magical and powerful, and it certainly was for me. So I started to ask the question, why doesn't everyone in the world have this? How can we spread this kind of small group experience? At first, I thought I was going to be building a matchmaking service, going on LinkedIn, finding people with common interest and purpose and database problem at scale. But it turns out that that's, one, a little bit hard, and two, there's tons of communities and schools and companies that have done that already, collected people. And we were using Zoom. When we started to run lots of circles on Zoom, we ran into these underlying assumptions, the underlying metaphor that pervades a lot of video conference tools like classrooms, one to many. They're really designed with presentation in mind, super useful in a setting like this, but a hindrance to the kind of quality of relationships that I think this community knows and believes is so powerful. And the problem with organizing people in rows instead of circles is that it leaves a ton on the table. It leaves a lot of our humanity on the table, what's best about us. It leaves the sharing of experiences, the good kind of peer pressure that pushes people to be their best, the openness and self-discovery, and in many examples, as large classrooms, even physically, rose in the 60s and 70s in across the world, teachers found it very draining, right? Instructors, because you lose the connection with students. And many organizations today, huge enterprises that are organized as rows, have this problem that Gallup measures as disengagement. The latest polls, 87% or more of our employees are little to a lot disengaged from those work communities. So when we started to build for circles, to build a video environment just with this kind of underlying philosophy, we get great reactions. Just so much energy unlocked. And part of it was from this growing movement of which the restorative practice world is a part, but there are other circles, traditions that are gaining popularity. Harkness method for teaching, action learning. I mentioned what's happening in the CEO world with what they call forum. Many, many examples. I noticed a few things that they have in common. Maybe stating the obvious, but it was helpful to kind of unpack what a circle is or what this kind of relationship is. Small group, we know this. But as John said, there's an intentionality, there's a design. The process drives the conversation. And then third, there's a facilitator, someone to keep the group faithful to the process. And what we notice is at their best, circles meet over time to get deeper and deeper levels of openness and group accountability and shared purpose. So we've partnered with lots of different organizations that have what I think of as circles traditions. Ken Blanchard's company does it in manager training. The Aspen Institute calls it digital seminars. I'll give you a couple more examples and stories in a minute. But really, they all do these things, and that lends itself well to technology, to scaling, how to make it easy to hold these designs, how to make it easy to convene small groups, how to make it easy to facilitate. So we're so proud of the work we did at Wharton with Pablo, because Pablo had a vision and a design for how to build community. And we were able to very quickly get 80 people comfortable running, 80 students comfortable welcoming other students in Circle. At Harvard Business School, we worked with them for a couple of years. They actually have a very deep circles pedagogy in executive ed. They built living groups when you go there, which are 8 small singles around a kitchen. And the first problem we solved, which is a really nice use of moving virtual, is after their 3-week in-person seminars or experiences, then what? How do you do continuous learning? How do you sustain the learning? So we would move these leaders that would come to Harvard into virtual circles, and for the rest of a year, they could apply and practice together and reinforce the relationships that are so valuable on campus. When COVID hit, they started to weave us into the fabric of the curriculum. And the best quote, one of the ones we're proudest of from them, is we replaced the dorm as well as the bar and the coffee shop. Because by making an intentional space for these students to come and build relationships. We were able to replicate some of those casual interactions that were really the reason why people pay big money to spend their time in an environment like that. Aspen has this tradition of text-based dialogue, digital seminars. When they couldn't do their 1 week in person, and this beautiful setting at Aspen, they were able to replace it with this intentional video space. And now in their next version, they're planning to do their next summer also online. They're able to use this dimension of time differently. You're not constrained by the week people came to Aspen. And they've noticed just how more equal the experience is, because people aren't showing up, driven or in planes. These world leaders are coming together and they're all beaming in on an equal playing field. So they're going to start the event months before by gelling groups and have the work be continuous month after this kind of central week. So they're really redesigning. I'm just really excited to be part of this community and to see where your imagination takes us. The worlds that virtual can open up, the new use cases, whether it's onboarding, and by the way, we do this in companies because people really need a friend when they start a new experience. What Pablo did, building community with the new class of Wharton undergrads. But I'm really happy because I know that this group shares the philosophies of what quality relationships can be in the world, how to bring the most humanness out of our humans and prepare our students for bringing that out once they get to the workplace. And I'm super happy to be part of scaling that with you and for you and trying to change the underlying shape of the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. And let me invite the other panelists to show their videos. So at this point in the conversation, we'd like to turn to question and answers. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and let us know what you're thinking and what you'd like to hear from the panelists. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I would just love to hear if you have any reactions to each other, if you'd like to share a story or two about something maybe that's happened in the last few months that you didn't get a chance to talk about.
Thanks, Josh. Something I thought about just listening to Dan and Pablo. I hadn't planned on talking about it, but these aspects of, I think I hear definitely in Pablo's story, the idea of navigating risk and vulnerability online. And I think, that was one of the things, many people attending today's webinar have probably seen or experienced or attended some of our listening circle events. That's one of the processes we teach. And one of the big questions where we were doing that already, but when we obviously had to build a much more robust, non-credit virtual platform, one of the big questions, and we were not necessarily unified in our opinions, was, will this work in the same kind of robust way in an online space? And one of the interesting things we found was it does work, but like I said in the beginning, it's different. It's not the same thing as being, knee to knee in a circle. But it has some of its own unique strengths as well. We heard from participants in some of the experiments we did that one of the benefits of an online space, particularly when there's a really emotional or risky topic. So we've done listening circles on racism, on the traumatic effects of COVID-19, on the US election. One of the advantages there is a sense that I can, even if you choose not to, I could eject. I could turn my camera off and take a breather and go walk around my room and come back to the conversation. I think the thing that Dan said too, and this is not just for those kinds of serious topics, the idea that even in socializing, I think of the sort of social competition, that the riskiness that comes with when you join a new workplace, you enter a new institution. One, of course, is the experience that you've paid for, the classes, the coursework, and all of that. But, probably what causes people the most anxiety is, will I fit in here? Will I make friends? Will I meet people like me? Are there negative subcultures here that I need to contend with? And online engagement doesn't negate that, but the idea that you're more reliably, or more frequently at least, entering a space where there's someone, like Dan said, not only maybe using a platform like the Circles platform that advantages and structures the space, but someone's job is there to think about, it's my job to facilitate relationships here. I can say, as someone who, goes to a lot of events, even those like informal mixers, even those of us who are good at it or can fake it. They're anxiety producing. You walk into a room and you have to network and do your thing and all of that. But it's triply so or quadruply so for a new grad student, probably struggling with impostership, entering a high profile program like Wharton's, wondering, will I fit? And everyone's going to find out I don't know what the heck I'm doing, or whatever the fears are. You can do some things that are a little more purposeful about creating safety with online engagement and facilitation. And I think you can mitigate some of that. Otherwise, what winds up being static in the line that gets in the way of learning. So it's a real change in dynamics.
Pablo, did you want to share something? No, okay. So I want to start with this question. We live in such a polarizing world, the role of social media, creating information vacuums, deeper wedges between people. I especially see this in the residence halls where students are living together for the first time with non-family members. What restorative strategies have you seen adapt well to the shifts we are making as a more globalized community? Who would like, maybe I can direct that one to you, Pablo, since you're probably working most with that community directly.
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. And it's definitely, what you're describing is 100% a reality that I'm seeing as well. That people are coming in with a degree of defensiveness or a degree of guardedness with relations to folks who have different ideas or experiences that is pronounced in a way that is pronounced in a different way than what I'd seen before. And I think that, regardless of the context, regardless of this nature of social media, et cetera, I think something Dan, John, and I all be on the same page about is that building authentic relationships, building a culture, building, engaging in spaces and in containers like Dan was describing that have built into their structure the idea of open, honest, and complete engagement. Can be really, really helpful in breaking down some of those barriers and helping folks connect. What I've been doing, I'm actually doing a lot of this work, not in residence halls, but in academic departments with staff and faculty who are having trouble engaging with one another. And one of the things that I've been doing is essentially, I call them sort of relational trust falls. In terms of how we're building connection, right? So we start by using the circle, using this type of dialogue to have conversations about important, real, vulnerable things, but that are less charged, right? That are maybe a little less polarized, that help people see and understand one another on a more human level, and learn, right, whether or not they can trust this other person to hear them, right, and to listen to what they're saying, and whether they feel they're able to hear and listen to these other people, right? And then work your way up. It's something that I've been doing a lot. It's actually, people are surprised. The biology department here at Penn has been really gung-ho about this kind of work. And so we've been setting up regular circles and just slowly deepening the conversation, going into touchier and touchier, spicier and spicier topics that then when people have that foundation of the platform, of the structure of the conversation, and then most importantly of those relationships, we're able to touch those polarizing issues without getting shocked. So that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, it's so cool to see how the difference is unfolding in its strengths and weaknesses as we've moved to digital. I mean, yes, there are people with new anxieties around technology. We've done a lot of testing with neurodiverse groups, and it's so interesting to see how people react to technology in very different ways, and that's opening an awareness. On the other hand, the chance to redesign social interactions without the patterns, something as subtle as everybody showing up evenly on a screen. You're not in the dorm with somebody having fancy stuff and somebody not, or obvious differences that are that trigger innate social pattern. You can redesign groups more fluidly. You can use diversity in a different way, and remove, see where the obstacles are, and change the process. based on data. So it's such an interesting experiment that we've all been thrust in at high speed.
So I'm seeing a few questions about some specific techniques or tools, prompts, questions that you use to foster connections in circles. Probably any time, but especially when you're starting out with a group.
Yeah, one of the things, and I was perusing the questions too. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of cross collaboration. So for instance, we're working with Dan and the folks at Circles that there are some just basic principles around relationships in circles that are as true in person as they are online. So some of those things transfer nicely. But like Dan and Pablo are saying as well, there are some things that are different when you do it online. So offering, unique advice to running circles using an online platform. For, a couple of people had asked, how can you learn more about circles? You can see on the IIRP website, if you go to the continuing education tab on the homepage, we offer training in listening circles. We offer training specific to K-12 schools, and there's another range of opportunities there. So just participating in those events, you can get some of the sense of how we do it. And I know Dan, he has a fantastic website that'll give you a sense of how the circles, I like it, how the circles platform works. But I think, you'll have some of the same challenges. The thing I would say, and I think even Dan would agree, buying a platform that's circular, has a circularity built into it, has a lot of the qualities that you would have as if you walked into a room with chairs placed in a circle. Just having that by itself is not a guarantee that the space will be used the way that it's intended, right? I could put people in a circle and lecture them for 3 hours. That doesn't mean I just ran a restorative process, right? And that sort of skill and competency development amongst, a couple of people talked about, how do you prepare leaders? It's not just buying the platform. It's not just putting the chairs in the circle. It's not just having a restorative practice coordinator like Pablo, because the way that I've seen organizations could misuse someone like Pablo is, great, we're doing restorative practices now. Pablo, I need you down here at 2 o'clock meeting for me. He gets this all the time, right? The point is to spread those competencies more widely, whether you're using the tools at hand like Zoom or, many of the, Blackboard or Moodle or any of the other platforms that are out there. I think one of the challenges, of course, just like a physical space, Circle, most of our physical spaces, and I would include to some extent, the shape of a computer screen even, are not advantaged. Circles is not a good actual use of, just sheer space, right? In a room, circles are inefficient to run in rooms built in squares and rectangles. We actually have some friends that are architects now. There's a whole new field of architecture that integrates restorative practices to think about how we're designing physical spaces, not building buildings like machines that humans inhabit, but building, space that are really meant for relationships. But online, I think especially as the technology adoption rate increases, the reality is all of us right now could be sitting in a virtual room looking at one another. That technology exists. It's just not widely distributed yet, or maybe not equitably available. It's probably more Dan's territory than mine, but I get excited about thinking about, as that rate of adoption of technology picks up, like we just experienced in the last 6 months, we very well could be sitting in a completely integrated virtual space, a couple of years from now, that's enhanced, as another thing that humans can do, as well as getting together in person for lunch. And I think that's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, John, whenever I go to an event, back when you could do this, I've always wanted everybody to have a name tag and a small timer indicating how long they've been talking.
I think that's huge. And I think, John, as you've been talking about throughout, and Dan as well, the thing that makes digital platforms workable is the same thing that makes in-person conversations and restorative processes workable, which is intention, right? Intention is the name of the game. So it's all about intention. It's all about preparation. And so I think the digital space, because it is in some ways lacking, as John talked about, in those intangibles, right? That energetic experience of sharing space, of those informal moments of going to grab coffee together after class or a meeting, right? those things are gone. And so to make best use of this space and this time, I think we need increased intentionality, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need to be all the more deliberate about how we're designing, how we're convening, how we're holding space for community building. And so, yeah, the platform helps, and we also have to bring just that extra level of intention.
I think that some of that is learning curve too, though, Pablo. Like, you know, this is all new for so many of us. My hope is that some of these practices become muscle memory, and we actually learn to go back to our physical spaces and open a meeting and close a meeting and run inclusion rounds to hear from everyone, and things that I think we're learning are just so important in virtual spaces. Practices like ask a question and then give people time to process, reflect that minute of reflection before getting the answers. And so I do think we're going to come back stronger.
I certainly hope so, and I think that that's true. There's a lot of good lessons to be learned from the changes we need to make in this moment. So I appreciate that.
I have a question that I thought was interesting. Professor, I think, asking that some of the students online are getting irritated when asked to engage. And you know, I was thinking in our graduate program, there's a lot of online threaded discussions. I don't know if that's universal across the board. That's definitely one of the ways, you know, when I was doing the degree, I was feeling really connected to people just typing. It wasn't Zoom wasn't even really prevalent then. But what, I don't know, I want to turn to John maybe about some of this ideas about engaging people who maybe aren't in the mood to engage.
Yeah, look, I think it's huge. I mean, I used the example with someone recently when we were talking about how to engage online of, my undergraduate, I was a literature major. When I finally started going to those courses where instead of, 25, 30 people in a room, where you could sort of read the preface, skim through the article, and you could kind of skate your way through class. When you suddenly show up in a seminar with 8 people, the chairs are in a circle, you have to have done your work or you're going to be very embarrassed, right? So I think one of the things that's different about the online space, which can really enhance learning, if I think especially professors are deliberate about it, it's really hard to hide. You can't show up, sit in the back of the classroom on purpose, have your tablet out or your laptop open, multitasking, sort of paying attention, and kind of the dynamics are completely different. When you're on, you're really on. And seen, and that equality goes 2 ways. One is for those who are, eager maybe to have more of an active voice, so you're more likely to get it. But, if you were hoping to kind of show up and like stay in the background, that's hard to do. And it becomes, for students, it can be a much more demanding environment. And I think, that's a good thing, again, if it's worked with intentionally. One of the things that came up, it may have been Dan, but there's a couple of other organizations that were doing collaborative projects with, using online space to see how the different norms that develop. And I think one of the things I would encourage every institution to do, whether you're running a classroom or, you're doing strategic planning with your organization or it's a leadership team, is to say, when we show up in an online space, even if we have norms for in-person, we had to do this ourselves at IIRP, as we went to be completely virtual as an organization, more or less, to say, this is a different space. We need to revisit our norms. What's okay and what's not. I don't want people, number one, making up onerous rules that I don't actually expect them to follow. Like, some people call it face muting, right? Sometimes you just need to turn off the camera and stop staring at a little postage-sized picture of yourself for a few minutes so you can walk around. Or other organizations said, for instance, in our organization, we tend to kind of stay on mute just to limit background noise. But that's not necessarily the one right way to do it. I interacted with another organization who said, we believe in leaving mute off when we're together. We want to hear your life in the background. We want to hear the kids and the dog and the Amazon delivery coming to all of our homes 5 times a day. And I don't think there's one right answer. The point is that you do it on purpose and you talk about it. This is what works for us in this team, not the one right answer.
I think it depends on what kind of engagement. I can't overstate how we've seen small group to be the missing piece in so many of these experiences. And, being called on randomly on a webinar and brought to the front is different. Wake up, we know you're there, from building intentional trust with a few people. And I think that modality is underused. And people will welcome the engagement once they know that they're being heard and valued and have that safety of a small group. So I think however you do it, it's an underused way to produce engagement and better experiences and outcomes, simply.
And I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I think that something that I've been hearing a lot directly from students about engagement, or I can put air quotes around engagement in online classes, is they're much more receptive to it, I think, as Dan was saying, when they trust it has a purpose and when they trust that they're getting something out of that engagement, right? The difference, as Dan was saying, between being called on to just be, now in front of everyone versus feeling as though they are receiving something from the engagement instead of only being asked something of it.
Yeah, well
and
said.
so it comes back to intention.
I'd just add too, under intention, the typical breakout group mode is under designed and under facilitated, right? Those two key elements. So they sometimes don't succeed.
I have a group that I'm working with right now where the students are about the point of putting a petition into the faculty because of how under designed and under facilitated their small groups are. They're saying we're teaching ourselves and it feels a waste of our time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's can't be overstated.
I just want to say we're getting a lot of great questions. I'm trying to stick to the higher ed field. I know there's folks in K-12 and you have great questions. We know this is a topic that is really of interest to everybody. So we'll probably be doing another webinar in the future on similar topics, maybe for K-12. But I wanted to take this question because I know that in higher ed, one of the first places where restorative was adopted was in conduct, student conduct. And so somebody's asking, how do you build that rapport on a virtual connection with somebody who's there for a disciplinary reason? And Pablo, I know that your work, yeah, okay, I see the sigh. I know this is one of the areas you're starting to work with, so I don't know if you have any thoughts that you could share.
I will say this is one, when we talk about what makes it different, I think this is one area where it is just harder. It's harder because those little, as we were talking about, those little subtle things that you can do to make someone feel safe in a conversation through the creation of your physical space and your bodily language, and offering food often helps. These are things that we can't do one-to-one, right? What I've found, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but making our initial outreach communications very clear and very intentional, trying to pack as much information and affective information into those communications as we can, so that students are understanding what kind of conversation they're coming into. I find that's been really helpful. And taking more time, when I have a student who's coming in for a conduct violation, when we're in person, we would start with some chat, right? We would start with a little bit of back and forth. Where are you from? Oh, my cousin lives there, whatever the case may be. Doing more and more intentional, getting to know you, ice breaking stuff in those conduct conversations has also been helpful, just to get people to understand on that one level deeper that I am not an image on the screen. I'm not Big Brother, right? I am another human being on the other end of this line who is trying to engage you in a restorative process. So that's my answer.
John, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, it relates to one of the other questions that was someone posted in the chat around, differences in mood and, I would say sort of like affective regulation. What happens in a group? What's different about a group managing that experience online, whether as an individual or a group, than say doing it in person? I think a lot of that is unknown. I think we're going to figure out over the next year. It certainly is going to be, for those who are interested in doing that kind of research, I think it's going to be a fascinating area to really now discover what are the differences and things we might want to either do more of or do less of, that either help or don't help. One of the things that's obvious, though, we had this experience of when we were thinking about the different ways we could provide online options for things we already did. One of the groups we do is very intense, and it asks people, it really involves real trauma that people have experienced. So people would obviously be, signing up to do it voluntarily, of course. But one of the things we had to consider, which was strictly a space and technology thing, was with groups like that, there was a sense of if the faces are too small, you lose a lot of the communication. So, you know, depending on what you're using to organize the experience, whether it's Zoom, you know, the more people you put on one screen, much less having people on two screens when you get over a certain number, it really does impact the communication ability. You know, I know with the, you know, when you put people in a circle, there's a certain number you're dealing with that maybe for certain things, you only want 8 versus 15 in one place. And I don't think there's easy answers to that. But I, you know, I had this interesting experience last night. There was a physical group that I am a part of that is still meeting, and we're following all of the, you know, the COVID-19 regulations. And this is a group that's normally, you know, very engaging, but when we're sitting in the same physical space, 6 to 15 feet apart, and everyone's wearing masks, I almost felt like I'd rather be on Zoom, you know, in the current, just, you know, given the oddity of the current situation we all find ourselves in. So I think it's, you know, having those options is a good thing. But I think, you know, body language, you can't get all of it when you're online, you know, until we're all in a virtual space together, you know, and then we probably won't know if we're interacting with the real person or their avatar, their algorithm with their notes. But, you know, until we're all, like, say, in virtual spaces together, you know, you have to take those things into account. There's an element of, like what Pablo was saying, I've seen with groups that meet a lot, you have to be cautious, I think, to be very deliberate, finding a way. And I just think it's a little more challenging to do online, to schedule like hanging out time when people aren't on. Otherwise, everything the group does is waiting to press on, and then we're all sort of like the camera's rolling. You know, even if it's a very authentic experience, there needs humans to bond, need unscripted time with one another too. And, you know, I think it's a great space for innovation. I don't have all the answers to it yet. You know, we're experimenting, as I'm sure a lot of other people are too.
I want to try to squeeze in one more question. I think this is universal for everybody. What happens when there's a flame war starting in the chat, or people are, you know, I mean, that's there, right? In all these, depends on the size of the group, but any tips for this? Any thoughts on this? No thoughts on this.
Well, I will say I have been lucky enough. Maybe I can give myself too much credit and say I have done a good enough job creating containers where this has not happened in any space that I have been facilitating or actually even participating in so far. Now, I'm going to say it's probably luck, more so than skill, but none of that has happened. But one thing that I've been engaging with another sub-school within the university where this did happen and was happening a lot, especially over the summer. And what we're doing, our approach is we're designing a process to collectively generate group norms for the chat space, right? So the same sort of norming process we would do for an in-person circle or a group, we're trying to adapt that and engage the whole of this community in the school in a norming process so that there can be just shared values, shared norms that are going to guide how people are engaging in the chat. I think that that's going to be a helpful first step, and built into those norms are going to be expectations for what happens if someone is in violation of those norms. So that's the approach we're taking to try to get out ahead of that.
Yeah. Dan, there were some questions about the Circles platform. Do you just want to say a word or two about the nuts and bolts while we got everybody still?
Sure. I mean, we're a company that's just after this mission of making it easy to create lots of high quality circles at scale so the world can grow together. And we're solving a bunch of problems that our partners have shown us in doing that. It starts with making circles, you know, applying diverse criteria and scheduling and herding the cats to get into circles. We have technology we call our Launchpad. It's a custom video space. It's web video built for safety. So we actually don't have recording. We have single links. It's always encrypted, very simple interface. And that's intended to make it really easy to apply designs like IIRP does, and allow, you know, designers like Pablo to be able to create structures that then facilitators can follow very easily in that space. And then we have a dashboard of analytics to show how things went. I think John talked about equal talk time as a metric earlier. Just being able to track whether, the 600 kids that Pablo was dealing with showed up. Did they get through their agendas? They had an opportunity to rate each circle very simply. And with that kind of data, it's another advantage of digital. We can continue to get better and better. So we do, sometimes the best interface is a human being. So we do work with teams and have some people that can help. And then, very collaboratively with partners like IIRP, whose experts can be brought to bear to create these experiences.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who came. We had over 200 participants. Some people were asking. It's great to have you from all over. I'm going to leave the chat open for a few minutes after the webinar closes if you want to continue chatting. And again, thanks so much. All right. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure.